The benefits of being a white person are like shrinking and shrinking and shrinking to be an ordinary white person, a regular white person, not a wealthy, rich white person. And so the payoff for white supremacy, the clientele for that payoff is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And in a sense, the majority of the white American population is dropping down to where black people are, which is to say your unemployment rate, your living conditions, your level of debt, your level of social anxiety is coming down to where we are. And I would like to say welcome to the club, or misery loves company. But I would prefer to think that once you comprehend that, there'll be a possibility of more joint action to correct that situation. And it raises, it's not just something that affects us, as black people, it affects you. And the failure of this nation to deal with that in the past has consequences for you. And I'll briefly give you a sweeping overview of how this came about, and then I'll narrow down on how, in fact, this impacts on you today.
What's up, YouTube family? Welcome back to my space. This is Evans Rayola. Guys, thank you so much for tuning to watch today's episode. So guys, on today's episode, we want to talk about the cost of racism to white America. And to speak to us today is John Bracey. John Bracey has this analogy that I liked so much and thought that I should share with you. When we talk about racism or talk about white supremacy, we always think of how it is affecting, black folks. But the funny thing, according to the analogy that it's about to be presented to you by John Bracey, he insists that racism also affects, the white community in America. And he says that the benefits of being a white person is shrinking each and every day. Right now, there are no those white privileges. He believes that instead, the racist ideologies, the supremacy that they try to push is in turn affecting them today. So guys, I want us to delve into today's video, get to understand this analogy by John Bracey. Once the video is done, we will get back and do a critical analysis about the same. Let's watch this together, fam.
What I want to talk about, they asked me to talk long about Black History Month. And in most cases when you talk about the achievements of African Americans and what things that people don't know about what African Americans have done. But what I find is more effective in the recent years is to try to explain to white Americans what racism has cost them. Most people really aren't that concerned about, at a fundamental level, about the disadvantages that are placed upon African Americans. A lot of people rationalize those disadvantages or don't want to deal with them. So I've always found it more effective to say that racism is not free for anybody, and that you pay the price, for what has happened to African American people, that you're not getting off scot-free, and that if you still believe in white supremacy or any hints of white supremacy and are not at the absolute top of the social structure, you ought to go looking for somebody to be mad at, right? Because the benefits of being a white person are like shrinking and shrinking and shrinking to be an ordinary white person, a regular white person, not a wealthy, rich white person. And so the payoff for white supremacy, the clientele for that payoff is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And in a sense, the majority of the white American population is dropping down to where black people are, which is to say your unemployment rate, your living conditions, your level of debt, your level of social anxiety is coming down to where we are. And I would like to say welcome to the club, or misery loves company. But I would prefer to think that once you comprehend that, there'll be a possibility of more joint action to correct that situation. And it raises, it's not just something that affects us, as black people, it affects you. And the failure of this nation to deal with that in the past has consequences for you. And I'll briefly give you a sweeping overview of how this came about, and then I'll narrow down on how, in fact, this impacts on you today. Virtually every discussion of American history, every part of the national narrative that you've been taught immediately gets qualified or disqualified once you bring in the reality of the African American experience. That's why there was always such a widespread resistance to the teaching of the African American experience. Every national mythology, every slogan, right? Every, song you sing, land of the free, home of the brave, when you say, what about black people, you have to start qualifying. In some cases, you have to throw it totally out. This is a democracy. What about slavery? We all created equal. What about Jim Crow? We can rise as far as you can based on your individual merits. What about discrimination, disenfranchisement, quotas? Every single thing, every single part of the national mythology has to be called into question when you bring in the African American experience. And this is not something new. This is at the beginning, the foundations of the country. The mythology of Puritans landing at Plymouth Rock, colonists seeking religious freedom in Virginia. They're trekking slaves with them all the way. The first commonwealth to make slavery legal was Massachusetts, not Georgia, not Virginia, not South Carolina, Massachusetts. Right? There were slaves in every one of the 13 original colonies. So a narrative of a search for freedom and liberty is immediately qualified, but what about these slaves you have around you? The state that had the largest number of slaves outside of the South, outside of Georgia, second most largest, New York. This is not a down there phenomenon. You can say, well, I'm from north, slavery was down there somewhere. No, slavery was here. And a mythology, that tries to make racism something somewhere else robs you of your understanding of your relationship to that history. Disarms you in your ability to function in the world, with the antagonisms that you see before you. And it's just part of the cost, right? The political cost after the American Revolution. The majority of slaves in the American Revolution fought for the British. Why? Because a monarchy promised to give abolition to those that fought. The patriots, fighters for liberty, did not. Right? So if I'm a slave and have a choice of who I'm going to run away and fight for, I'm fighting with Lord Dunsmore in South Carolina. I'm fighting with the British, right? Not with George Washington, a slaveholder, or Thomas Jefferson, a slaveholder, or Patrick Henry, a slaveholder. Give me liberty or give me death. What about me? Great slogan. Right? The failure to extend that ideology, right, throughout the society calls that ideology into question. It's beginning cost to racism is hypocrisy. You have a democratic Republican constitution. Well, first of all, democracy can't be democracy if half of the population, females, are put in a box and sent over there somewhere. Like, we're not even talking about them yet. Let's not even talk democracy, talking about human beings. Democracy means like men, and white men with property, So just the notion of democracy, it's like a narrow, finite notion at the beginning. And this is built into the Constitution, right? When the country is set up, And to handle this problem, we set up one of the great quota systems of all time, which is to say the House and the Senate. People talk about they don't believe in quotas and affirmative action is quotas. The U.S. Senate is a quota system. Every state gets 2 senators, regardless of population. Is that fair? Rhode Island and Texas are equal. North Dakota, California are equal. 400,000 white people in North Dakota have the same number of senators as 20 million people that live in California. It's a quota system. People don't object to that one. I haven't heard a word about that one. Right? So a fundamental inequality was built into the Constitution at the beginning. Why? To handle the problem of what? Slaves. Right? We were here as property. We were brought here as property. Right? But when it came time to count people in terms of representation in the House, we became people all of a sudden. The same people that owned us and kept us on a list with horses and cows, barrels of molasses, discovered when it came time to get political representation, we were people and should be counted for purposes of representation, right? Well, since the founding fathers were wise men, we got the discount, 3/5. We weren't whole people, we're 60%, 40% off, right? So in fact, built into the Constitution is everybody's people except black people who get 40% off, right? How do you walk around the world and talk about democracy when the Constitution says that? The Constitution says that. It's not an add-on. It's the original, right? What does this ensure? Right? Non-democratic representation in the national government of slaveholders. First presidents, Supreme Court justices, right? A national policy, right, that pursues slavery as a policy while talking freedom, right? All of the major wars in this country down to the Civil War are fought to extend slavery. The most expensive war before the Civil War was the war with the Seminoles, Florida, Alabama, swamps. Why? Slaves were running away, hiding among the native population. Creeks, Choctaws, Chickasaws, Cherokees, Seminoles. The native populations were fighting to maintain their freedom and their independence to keep those slaves with them as free people. This country spent $40 million fighting to exterminate Native Americans in the eastern part of the United States. When they couldn't exterminate, they shipped the Cherokee, the 5 civilized tribes they call them, on the Trail of Tears in 1842 out to the west, Oklahoma, reservations. They confined the Seminoles, who are still at war technically with the United States, into the Everglades in Florida. It's the most expensive war this country fought before the Civil War. Not about freedom, but to extend slavery. Right? It's the next war for the Civil War, Mexican War. Remember the Alamo. Let's not remember the Alamo. They have yet to make a movie about the Alamo. They made another one trying to clean it up a little bit. Where's the movie that says that Jim Bridges a slaveholder? David Crockett's a slaveholder. Sam Houston is a slaveholder. Stephen A. Austin is a slaveholder. They are fighting to expand slavery into Mexico because Mexico had abolished slavery. Santa Anna may have been a dictator, but there was no slavery in Mexico, and slaves were running away from the South into Mexico to be free. Freedom-loving Texans carrying their slaves into Mexico said, you cannot bring these people here. We don't have slavery. What's the response to declare Texas independent? Not for freedom, but to expand slavery. Make that movie. Put Denzel in that one. As a slave who had run away and is fighting in the Mexican army at the Alamo. That's the movie. Black people in the Mexican army at the Alamo fighting slaveholders. Make that movie. See, the cost of racism is you don't know what happened in this country. You glorify slaveholders as heroes because you don't know they're slaveholders. You're not taught that. You walk around in complete ignorance of that. Right? You have political leadership in the 19th century that ignored slavery. Right? The people that said abolish slavery, we are taught are fanatics. William Lloyd Garrison, oh, fanatical abolitionist, oh, fanatic. John Brown, oh, he's crazy. John Brown, oh, he's crazy. Oh, no, crazy. No. What did Garrison believe? Slavery was wrong, should be abolished. Why does that make you crazy? Why is that a sign of lunacy? Why is Thomas Jefferson not crazy for owning slaves? And William Lloyd Garrison's crazy for wanting to abolish slavery. That's what you teach in your books. Look at the paragraph on William Lloyd Garrison in any textbook you got. See what they say about it. And John Brown. What did John Brown want to do? John Brown believed in direct action. He was a good American. Got a problem, solve it. How do you solve the problem of slavery? John Brown said, well, it's very simple. You kill all the slaveholders. That's the American way, right? That's why we have the largest military in the world. When we have a problem, kill it. Right? You don't like something, kill it. Right? That's why we got this massive military. Right? You got to drop bombs on it. John Brown was an American. He said, we have a problem. Slavery, kill it. They said, oh, no. He's crazy. Why is he crazy? Well, he started to do it. Went to Kansas and Nebraska, to stop the expansion of slavery by killing slaveholders. Guess who caught him? Robert E. Lee at Harper's Ferry in the Union Army. And they told John Brown they were going to hang him. John said, I understand. I lost. I didn't win. You know what his last words were? He said, do you regret what you did? He said, the problem was we didn't kill enough people. He said, I made a mistake because I thought we could solve this problem by killing a few slaveholders. He said, we're going to have to purge this land with blood before we end slavery. Now you would think that somebody listening to that would say, slavery is a problem, let us end it and solve this problem. Nobody did. What happens 2 years after John Brown is dead? Fort Sumter, the Civil War. There are more casualties, dead and wounded, in the Civil War than in all the American wars combined. All of them. World War I, World War II, Vietnam, Spanish-American War, and the numbers in Iraq. More in the U.S. Civil War to abolish slavery than in all the wars this country's fought combined. No. But if you had said to white Americans, give me 1 million lives to free the slaves, they said, no, I'm not doing that. But to ignore slavery cost 1 million lives. Right? To not have compensated emancipation, you had in the West Indies. Right? To ignore racism, right, cost almost 1 million white people their lives. Not black people. They wouldn't even let us in the army. There were only 200,000 black people that had to fight their way into the army to fight. Right? They had to demand the right to fight. And they wouldn't even pay them equal wages. So they said, don't pay us anything. The 54th and 55th turned back to pay. They said, we can't pay you what we pay white people because you're not good enough. And besides, you're black. They said, don't pay us anything. We'll fight for free. Right? For free. It cost 1 million white people their lives. And over 1 million white people their limbs and their arms. Over slavery. But if you had put that on the table, nobody would have bought it. But the failure to deal with slavery, that's the price white people paid. For looking the other way. For ignoring it, saying, well, it's not my problem. We'll deal with it next year sometime. Right? So you think maybe people would learn, right, after slavery is over. All black people say, well, let's forget about the past, don't dwell on slavery. Can we have the minimum to live as Americans? We worked for over 250 years with no compensation. Can we have just 40 acres, small farm, and 1 mule to work it? No. No. Can't have it. Son American. You're free now, you're on your own. Well, what about back pay? No. No, you're not entitled to anything. You're free, you're on your own. And so black Americans tried to put their lives together as ex-slaves and made the most remarkable transitions in American democracy this country's seen. The first public schools in the South were put into place by Reconstruction governments dominated by ex-slaves. Free public education for everybody. You had no public schools in the South because to educate white Southerners would be the slaves might hear something and learn something, therefore nobody gets educated. Right? The price of keeping black people dumb is to keep white people just as dumb. And they're proud of it. At least they're not black. Right? That's why even today, when you think higher education, great schools, you don't think Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia. Right. Some of those places didn't get mandatory school attendance until the 1970s. 1970s, you didn't have to go to school. It wasn't the law that said you had to go to school in Mississippi to the 1970s. Right? White or black. You know. Black people set up the public state universities in the South during Reconstruction. University of South Carolina. First president was a black man, Richard T. Greener. University of Mississippi. University of Georgia. For everybody, not just for themselves, for everybody. White people looked at those, threw the black people out, said, this is barbarism. We can't have this, like, put them out. And then they kept the schools. They didn't say the schools are bad, they said you can't have them. They hadn't thought of it themselves. And then they threw black people out of political office. The Klan, armed struggle, military force drove black people back into desegregation, disenfranchisement, segregation. And then you had the turn of the century, you have Jim Crow. Where they said, we're not going to deal with race anymore. It's too much of a hassle, but you're here today. Right? We're going to let Southerners handle Southern problems. And if they think it's necessary to oppress the black population to keep things in order, that's okay. Right? How do you pay for that? Well, you know how you pay for that? When white immigrants come over in the 1880s in large numbers, 14 million from 1880 to 1920, right? What they learn how to be is white. They're not white in Europe. They're Italians, they're Germans, they're Poles, they're Irish, they're Jews. When they come to America, all of a sudden there's something called white. And they say, look, in America, regardless of how low you fall, there are black people up underneath you. So you know where you're better off when there's no black people around. Right? Or if they're around, you're stepping on them. That way you know you're not at the bottom. And white immigrants, by and large, bought this. And they established organizations that were segregated. Trade union movement, American Federation of Labor, right? The Brotherhood of Railway Trainmen, conductors, firemen, maintenance away, whites only. Plumbers unions, whites only. Mechanics, whites only. Firemen, whites only. Policemen, white only. You know. To this day, there are only three black people in the electrical unions in the state of Massachusetts. 1, 2, 3. A legacy of that. We're not even going to talk about police and fire departments. We know about those. They're in the papers all the time. White only. Right? What is this to cost to white people? You form an all-white union and go to negotiate a contract. I want $2 an hour. I got news for you. I'll pay the niggas $1. Uh-oh. Don't like it? Quit. I can get niggas in here for $1. Okay, I'll settle for the $1.50. It just costs you some money. Racism costs you money. I want unemployment compensation. Niggas don't have that. Okay, I'll pull that off the table too. To this day, the working class in this country is the most poorly organized in the world, and it took us to the 1930s to get the minimum of social gains that every European working class had in the 1880s. National health insurance, we don't have. Workers' compensation, unemployment compensation, Social Security had to come to the 1930s. Why? Because every time white people ask for it, they say, black people don't have it. You want them to have it? They say, oh, no, no, no. So they didn't have it. People hurt themselves. Right? White workers took jobs that were hazardous because they were white jobs. The best example is working in textile mills. You know, North Carolina, 1920s, textile mill, big looms, huge looms, whole room, big as this room, white job, right? No child labor laws. Who works in those plants? Young white kids. What is their job? To crawl up under the loom and take the knots out. What happens when you do that? You pull a knot out, the machine moves, the kid is crushed. Thousands of needles in their bodies and they die. That's a white job. Black people aren't allowed in those plants. Where are the young black kids? Going to school. Can't get a job in the factory. Send them to school. Racism is costing white people. White Southerners are sending their kids to work. Black people are sending their kids to school because they can't get in a racist factory. Who's hurting who? Who's benefiting from that? And then they finally unionize. They make a movie, of course, Norma Ray, white person. We know that's not true. They didn't unionize those mills until they brought black women in there, the 1930s. It's black women that said, we're not taking this. They said, no, we always take out the trash. No, this says work these machines, so nobody no trash. And by the way, my husband's in the yard, he's not making no money, so we're going to talk about that too. You know, white women organized the textile workers in North Carolina. Black women did. And the white women dragged along behind. Of course, they make the movie. They're not going to put no sister in that. Henry Berry's not going to play no union organizer. Right? So y'all think that Norma Ray organized all them people. No. Racism costs you because you don't know what's going on. Right? You're confused. Right? How does this affect policy in this country during the 20th century? Those same white politicians that got the 3/5 representation under Jim Crow, they got all of us discounted. If I'm Eastland or Bilbo, Strom Thurmond, and I want to run for office, what's the population of my county, or my state, or my congressional district? 60% black, 70% black. They can't vote. There's a literacy requirement, but that means illiterate white people can't vote. There's a poll tax, poor white people can't vote. What is my constituency? 5 to 10% of the people in my congressional district. Who's that? Me and my cousins. And you wonder how I got seniority in Congress. There's nobody can run against me.
Family, this is actually very, very new to me. Having a scholar who can just show us a different side, to white supremacy and to racism. He says that the benefits of being a white person is shrinking and shrinking every day. The payoff of white supremacy and its clientele is getting smaller and smaller. There's no clientele to white supremacy nowadays. The majority of white population is dropping down to where black people are. Their unemployment rates, their living conditions, their level of debt, level of social anxiety is coming down to where we are. And Dr. John Bracey proceeds to say that welcome to the club. Welcome to the club, finally. We've been going through a lot as the black folk. We've gone through a lot of slavery for more than 500 years. Then we've gone through this discrimination, various forms of discrimination. We've gone through slavery. We've gone through colonialism, There's been a lot that has been embedded, in black communities all over the world by the white supremacists. But right now, by this teaching that we just got from Professor John Bracey, they are also being affected. And guys, John Bracey is a distinguished historian and scholar in Afro-American studies. He explored multifaceted ways in which racism adversely affects white Americans in his lecture. The cost of racism to white America, contrary to the common perception that racism solely benefits white individuals. Bracey argued that systemic racism imposes significant economic, political, and social cost on white communities as well. And guys, I went further to do more research, and we want to put this research into a series, of themes that just tries to prove us why white folks are being affected, by what they are trying to perpetuate on black individuals. Number one, we want to talk about the economic impact. Bracey emphasizes that racism has historically undermined the economic well-being of white Americans. You'd wonder why. Myself, I'd say that racism and discrimination has actually undermined the economic well-being, of black folks. Why did he say the economic well-being of white Americans? During the era of slavery and segregation, employers exploited racial divisions by using underpaid black labor to suppress wages and weaken labor unions. This practice eroded the bargaining power of white workers, leading to the diminished wages and job security. Right now, you cannot tell a black folk, that they want to bargain and they know what they can offer, in a farm. Right now, it's difficult because the practice eroded the bargaining power of white workers, leading to diminished wages and job security. White workers can, right now, it's difficult for them to bargain, while the black counterparts can do that, It's affecting them economically, what they embedded on black folk. Then we have the political and democratic distortions. The institution of slavery and the subsequent racial policies distorted the American democratic system. Mechanisms like the 3-5 Compromise granted disproportionate political power to slaveholding states, thereby diluting the political influence of non-slaveholding white citizens. This imbalance entrenched undemocratic structures that affected all Americans. If you thought that it's only affecting black folk, no. Even the white people are going through, what they've made us black folks pass through. They're going through the same effects that we've been feeling for many years, finally. Then we have the social and psychological costs. Bracey discusses how racism imposes social and psychological burdens on white Americans. He says that racial ideologies confined white women to domestic spheres under the guise of protection, limiting their autonomy and societal participation. Moreover, the pervasive fear and mistrust endangered by racist ideologies fostered a climate of anxiety and division within the white communities. They're slowly dividing themselves. This just makes me so happy, having to be told by a scholar, with facts, how racism and white supremacy is affecting white America. I did not see things from this angle before. Then we have the moral and spiritual consequences. Racism also exacts moral and spiritual costs. White individuals may experience guilt or shame for being part of a legacy that has oppressed people of color. This moral ambivalence can lead to spiritual emptiness and a loss of ethical integrity. You have this guilt that your people made people of color go through. A series of pain, a series of what you wouldn't want yourself to go through. You just get being down spiritually. And at the same time, from the spiritual realm, these are the people of God that you pass through adverse, racism. They pass through being beaten, slavery, spiritually. That is not okay morally. These are human beings. Slowly these things start to affect you. You sit down and you wonder, my people did this. It starts affecting your generations. Spiritually you get affected. Morally you're not upright. There's something that is in you that feels guilt. Then we have the intellectual and cultural limitations. The perpetuation of racial ideologies results in intellectual and cultural losses. White Americans often receive distorted, biased, and limited views of the cultures and histories of people of color. This lack of exposure hinders the development of a comprehensive understanding of society and perpetuates ignorance. In conclusion, Bracey's analysis reveals that systemic racism is detrimental not only to its direct victims but also to those who, on the surface, appear to benefit from it. By understanding these costs, white Americans can recognize the importance of dismantling racist structures for the betterment of all. Family, let me know in the comment section down below what you think about, Bracey's analogy of how white people are being affected by the ideologies of racism and white supremacy. Like this video so that it can be recommended to other YouTube users, and I'll be so grateful. Last but not least, kindly do consider subscribing to this channel. We endeavor to post a lot of works in regards to our history as the Black folk. We endeavor to empower the Black folk, and we also get to learn together, because there's a free space you get to share, and you can also comment on the comment section down below and let me know who you want me to feature next on this channel as we try to empower Black folks all over the world. Thank you guys. We are currently on the road to 50,000 subscribers, and I cannot do it without your support. Thank you, and see you all in my next episode. Goodbye for now.